talk about a topic today that's a pretty important one and a difficult one. And we have kind of a big role. So we would like to possibly reframe the discourse on race. And we want to move beyond. The frame that's here we think is actually very limited and potentially harmful. So now, look at us. I am Joe Hart.
I'm Rennick, Brutus.
We both help people improve in their personal and business lives.
We both care about making the world a better place.
We believe our lives have meaning and we're here for a deeper purpose.
We both love listening to Bob Marley and the Wailers while we were in college.
Well, we were slightly enhanced.
Did you have to say that? I worked on Wall Street.
I know how to milk a cow by hand.
Okay.
I'm an immigrant. I grew up in Guyana, South America during a period of severe racial unrest.
My grandfather immigrated from the Czech Republic, and the KKK burned crosses in my grandparents' yards.
We're both dads.
We've been friends for more than 20 years.
I'm a vegetarian.
I like meat, and I have dreams about bacon.
And probably the most obvious difference you'll notice is that I was born on January 20th, 1961.
And I was born on January 26th, 1961. So every January for 6 glorious days, I never let Rennie forget who was old. So we're going to talk about a serious problem with the wrong frame. We know as psychotherapists that if we have the wrong frame around the problem, it can't be solved. And we'll look at, these will make more sense as we go on. So part of what we're looking at is the current frame. It's not that it's wrong per se, but it's too limiting, it's too narrow of a focus. And we'll explain this more. And this is the jigsaw puzzle we're going to put together today. At the end, this may make some sense, hopefully, to all of you, that we're going to expand the frame. So I'm going to introduce and critique critical theory, which is the wrong frame with no solution.
And I'll share my story growing up in Guyana, this country in which I was born and raised and experienced violent racial unrest.
And then we're going to use our relationship as a model of how to move forward. And we're going to also speculate, if Rennick was my client and I was his psychologist, how we might address the issues of racism and race.
And I'll share two things. We both believe, and we'll argue, that dividing and splitting people by race is a very dangerous path. And what I also set up is maybe some new ways for us to deal with and have conversations around this matter of race.
And the other piece I'll cover is a meta theory that may help us begin to think forward in a broader way. So I'm going to read this slide and have you just kind of listen and take this in. And my question is like, how the hell did we get here? On having whiteness, this is an abstract of a peer-reviewed journal article in what's considered a premier journal in the field of psychoanalysis. Whiteness is a condition one first acquires and then one has, a malignant, parasitic-like condition to which white people have a particular susceptibility. The condition is foundational, generating characteristic ways of being in one's body, in one's mind, and in one's world. Parasitic whiteness renders its host appetite voracious, insatiable, and perverse. Once established, these appetites are nearly impossible to eliminate. Effective treatment consists of a combination of psychic and social historical interventions. There is not yet a permanent cure. We'll come back to this slide later. Now, are you surprised that this author is white? And I think about, like, how would this person score on a scale of self-compassion? Or in my dissertation, I use the internalized shame scale. And again, if we've learned one thing maybe in the past 125 years of our profession, it's that shame never really changes. So now I'm going to have, coming up later today is Dr. Mario Burns, and I'm using his abstract. So I was going to, instead of reading his abstract, I'm going to have him read this for us.
Thank you so much, Joe. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Race is not a biological reality, but rather a peculiar social construct used to divide people. Race is problematic because the concept is unclearly understood and defined from a psychological perspective. Terms used for race are fraught with controversy because there is no clear definition or meaning. There is no credible information, documentation, or evidence that supports human beings being inherently different based upon race. And the use of race in any method of research within science and academia is stigmatizing and should not be used. Thank you.
So how did we get here? So our society and our profession have been taken over by the frame of critical theory. And it's actually a Neo-Marxist that promises to liberate the oppressed. But I think it's creating more division and hatred. Every time a version of this political theory has been used historically, it's failed. It is poor. And our hope today is to challenge you to rethink how you think about race. And hopefully we can find a way forward in a path that's realistic, that's healing, and that's hopeful. So critical theory began in the period between World War I and World War II in Frankfurt, Germany. And it was looking at how societies are shaped by power and domination. So it's only looking through a power lens. And that how social structures and norms often reinforce these inequalities and injustices. So it moved beyond where Marx talked about the proletariat and bourgeoisie. It changed to the oppressor and the oppressed, which I think is unfortunate. And I'll talk about the danger of moving people into two groups. And I'll have to confess that I actually, early in my career, I was in a Catholic seminary, and I was enamored with liberation theology, which was a combination of Marxism and Christianity. So I can understand the appeal that this model has had. So there was an evolution. It began as critical theory, moved to critical legal theory, in the 90s, to critical race theory, today to critical social justice theory. And so where this starts moving into therapy, so there is a model of psychotherapy that uses this frame. I'm not aware of any empirical evidence to support it, but it is being taught. You can get a CEU. So this begins to move toward challenging these power structures. So instead of working solely with our client, we're working with how this affects our client in society, and then maybe empowering them to change some things in society. So instead of a goal of improving mental health, the goal becomes changing society to more equal outcomes. And then this is kind of a key component here. Is it equality or is it equity? And in critical theory, it's equity. And if there's any difference between groups, it's proof of racism. So the other opposing way of looking at this is equality, where we try to continually improve the equal chance on the playing field of life. Now I want to use two psychological models to critique critical theory. And the first, I'm going to use this concept from Nolan Klein, who's one of the great students. It's called splitting. And we're familiar with this term. You know, it's a primitive defense mechanism where people will see other people as all good or all bad. And And so this really, if we think about this model, it promotes a type of psychological splitting. The oppressors are all bad, and the oppressed are all good. This kind of creates this concept of othering. And we know that in Reddit, we'll talk more about this in areas where there was severe racial and ethnic civil wars, this is the kind of model they would use. They would amplify historical grievances. They would demonize the other as all bad. And we talked about this yesterday. 80,000 people a day were killed for 100 days in a row. We talk about the veneer of civilization coming off. In Kosovo, these are people that live together. We'll talk about neighbors, people that intermarried. And then suddenly, when we divide them based on their group, their ethnicity, their race, in 9 years, 13,000 people were killed. And only stopped with the threat of sending NATO forces in. So now I've got a little game we can play. Let's guess who the author is. So this author said, the art of leadership consists of consolidating the attention of the people against a single adversary and taking care that nothing will split up that attention, right? This group has to be all bad. And the leader of genius must have the ability to make different opponents appear as if they belong to one category. And this author also scapegoated a single ethnic racial group and called them parasites. Do I have anybody who?
Was it Hitler? Yeah. Mine.
Like I said earlier, if we know anything, that shame and hatred never changes human behavior. Now, I replaced whiteness with Jewishness. So maybe take a moment to read this, and I think we could think this came right from Mein Kampf. So as he said, there is not yet a permanent cure, interesting choice of words, and I'm hoping that we don't push for a permanent solution, as we know what that meant. I just ran across this actually 6:30 this morning. I added this slide, and interesting. There's some studies that have been done looking at some of the dangers of critical theory. So this is sociologist Michael Bernstein. So he found that in one of his studies, 55% of college students agreed with at least one of three statements made by Hitler in Mein Kampf when he replaced Jewishness with whiteness. They believed it was true. Shame and hatred. Now, if we move beyond this, because we all know as therapists that all of us are capable of cruelty and hatred, as well as love and altruism. If not, we're splitting and we're othering. And this is one of my favorite quotes from Solzhenitsyn, who was a Soviet dissident. And he said, the line, and so here he was in prison, speaking against this evil system, and this is what he still believed. That the line between good and evil runs not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties, and I'm going to add, nor between races, but right through every human heart. We're capable of both. So the next model I want to look at is the existential critique of this model. So, right, is our goal to change social problems or create a utopia? Or is suffering really a universal part of the human condition? And again, one of the, I worked at Henry Ford Hospital, and our director of the psychiatry department said, if I had to use one sentence to say what psychotherapy was, I would say it's turning despair into hope.
Probably if you have to use one sentence, not that.
And, so is the goal of therapy to kind of make the world a safe place when people's feelings are hurt? Do we need to bubble wrap ourselves? Or is Viktor Frankl, who survived the Holocaust, said that man's search for meaning will arouse inner tension rather than inner equilibrium? Isn't that how we grow? And he often quoted Nietzsche, and this is one of my favorite quotes, is he who has a why to live can bear almost any how. So now, I'll turn this over to Renee, who will talk about some of his experience in a country that was divided.
So maybe you'll bring this up from there, please. Thank you. So first a little bit of geography. Guyana is in South America. It's not in Africa, it's not Guinea, it's not Ghana. So picture with me this little country at the top of South America. And then the next question I usually entertain is the one that is, so how's your English so good? Well, I'll give you the answer. It's because all I've ever spoken is English. Guyana is the only country in South America that speaks only English. And so if you could play with me what it might be like to know that you grew up in this English-speaking country and were bordered by countries that spoke different languages. Spanish in Venezuela to the west. Suriname, or Dutch Guyana, to the east, that speaks Dutch. And then Brazil, to the south, speaks Portuguese. So if you wonder, by the time I'm through, why I've connected to a common language that is not spoken, but a universal human language, you'll realize it was because I had no choice. How do you communicate with people who speak different languages or have different interests or come from different backgrounds? Well, if you are striving to connect on a deep human level, you find the common elements that unite us. And as you'll see, we'll talk about this.
Which one is Guyana? I'm sorry, I can't read it.
The middle. let me go back for just a second. Was not showing on the screen. So you see Venezuela in orange
Okay,
at the very top.
yes.
Guyana is the one in red.
Oh, okay, thank you. Oh, yeah.
Thanks for asking. So do I look like this child still? Please say yes.
A lot like it.
And I know you talk about being stifled in your adult development. And when I hear you speaking those terms, I think, oh, maybe that applies to me because I've worn the same size of shoe ever since I was 10 years old. And I don't think I've grown very much, at least physically. But I do know that along the way, I've come to terms with what in retrospect I determined to be unrecognized trauma. And let me share with you what I mean by that. So imagine this little kid being hoisted to the windowsill to look out into the distance and see homes ablaze. Lots of homes ablaze. And then also, I'm talking about age 5, 6, seeing people run into this little compound in which we lived, bloodied, with severe lacerations, yelling, screaming, running from violent perpetrators at age 5, 6. I'm sure you deal with a number of people like that in your practices, don't you? No? Well, imagine this. Imagine being 5, 6, going to school on a bus, and for the very first day of stepping foot into that bus, knowing that you were entering into a place that had taken the lives of kids by virtue of it having been bombed. Therefore, do you think there's a little bit of trauma there? But if you looked at me, thank you, Jeff, you would think, oh, this guy's got it all together. Wouldn't you? I think so. Living close to murders, knowing, hearing from my parents that somebody had just been killed, people had been slaughtered. Why? Because of the quest for political power. And so, if you can imagine my older brother and I going to school, coming back home, sometimes after some extracurricular activities, but navigating this dark, lonely road, on one side of which were cane fields, growing sugar cane, and then on the other side, homes that housed residents who were now the enemy. Knowing, being cautioned by parents to not walk in that area. Why? Because there was a risk that we won't make it home. So, Joe brought this to my attention. So, Rennick, your life was, in a way, an incubator for PTSD. And I think you'll agree, he's right. Because what happens in the mind of a child who witnesses forced migration? Here these families that coexisted, lived together, people of Indian descent and African descent, who had been married, who were friends for generations, who all of a sudden were forced to flee based on their racial definition, and live in villages on the one hand, and in what we describe as schemes on the other. You've got such a powerful fingerprint, Joe. I'm impressed.
What was called in the square?
I'll go to that in just a moment. Brilliant question. Thank you for asking. So that precipitated economic collapse, forced migration across the country within it, and then, of course, the reason I'm in the United States, immigration, large-scale brain drain of people in search of peace and harmony, seeking to avoid these protracted periods of hate and distrust. To your question. So, there are two really smart guys, like, let's call them Rennick and Joe.
Well, of different races.
Well-dressed, but of different races, as you can see. One of Indian descent, one of African descent. These guys were buddies. In fact, they were godparents for each other's kids. They weren't members of the same political party. They clinked glasses and enjoyed really fine wine, and were educated at some of the most prestigious schools in the United Kingdom. A dentist, a lawyer. And then there came the moment. In fact, they led the clamor for independence of British rule, to take the former colony that was British Guyana to independence, which had been achieved in 1966 as a newly won independent country. But then with that opportunity came the quest. Who would become the very first prime minister, who would be prominent? And there the friction began. Chetty Jagan happened to be leftist and avowed Marxist, affiliated with the communist regimes. So too was Burnham, the black guy. He just didn't talk about it so boldly. And what that provided was a great opportunity for him to be supported by the CIA, the United States, because of course it was intent to protect the international order. How dare a little country be a beachhead for communism on the back door of the United States? Not a smart policy. That would not make much sense. So Burnham, being strategic, aligned with the United States and CIA, with their support, he emerged as someone who could be propped up, recognizing the threat, recognizing the risk. Chetty Jagan, the guy of Indian descent, decided to launch a campaign known as Apanjat. And in Hindi, that means vote by race. That was of strategic value to him because the country was.
So we can see identity politics isn't new.
Yeah, because the majority of the country was of Indian descent. So he knew that if he could move people and persuade them to vote based on their racial identity, he stood a good chance of winning. As you might imagine, that led to tribal political distrust and disagreement.
So what are the two races?
Of African descent,
Uh-huh.
descendants of slaves.
Right.
I'm proud to say I'm one. And proud to say along with that, that makes me of good stock. Think about it. Think about it. My foreparents were resilient. They survived in the bowels of a slave ship. You know that. And so I say to my friends, like Joe, when you look at me, know that I'm strong. I'm hardy. I'm made of good stock. And isn't that what you want in your organizations?
So what was the other side of the coin?
The indentured servants.
No,
Huh?
no, India.
Indian indentured.
See, so after slavery was abolished, the British took indentured servants from a number of places. China, Madeira, India. And so Guyana became very multi-ethnic. People of Chinese descent, Portuguese descent, Indian descent, African descent, and the native Indians. And so the British were called in to protect the country from disintegrating into massive, catastrophic loss, and of course death. The Indians had a different path. Similar in the sense that neither they nor those of African descent were taken there first class on the bowels of ship, and as indentured servants, certainly not pleasant trips. So they had that in common. What they had that was different, though, was opportunity, property ownership. You probably know there's a difference between slavery and indentureship. With indentureship, you get a chance to buy your way out after a certain period of time, and to own, and to have earned and own property. That in itself, as an economic system, allowed not only for the splitting that Joe referred to by the politicians, but for a significant difference in economic opportunity.
One group could own property and one group couldn't?
That's correct.
Doesn't seem right.
And actually, that's the system that explains much of what we have in the United States today. Slaves were not allowed to earn or to own property. So, and I'll share with you some of the economics of it. Of course, I can't help myself, having been trained as an economist. So what was the aftermath? In a country of just 700,000 people, within just weeks, lots of blood, lots of death, lots of distrust that precipitated social, economic, and political decay that it has never recovered from.
I'm sorry.
No, this is
So
good.
we've had the two groups that lived peacefully together. Was that because the British were controlling things, or what caused that to happen?
Excellent. They were joined in that their role was very similar. Work in the fields, work on the plantations to build an economy.
Right.
Rice, bauxite, sugar. So they were laborers, as this slide shows. Clive Thomas, I had the good fortune of studying on the hymn. He described it. Racial disunity hampered the objective unity. They had worked side by side harmoniously, lived together in the same villages, go into the fields, go into the factories, producing for the economic growth of the country. But then there came the moment or period when a guy of black descent, a guy of Indian descent decided, I want to be in charge. I want to be the first prime minister of this country. And my best chance to accomplish that is to split, is to divide these harmonious groups by saying to one group, listen, just vote based on race. You are of Indian descent. You come together as Indians of East Indian origin. You vote, you become a bloc. And you other guys of black descent, tough. See how life works out for you.
So, even during the peaceful times, there was some kind of an undercurrent there that really either wasn't acknowledged or didn't emerge until the British left and the leadership of the country became an issue?
That's a great question. I guess one could argue that, and it would be an interesting study to understand what were the undercurrents that made it so easy for people to be persuaded, and so quickly, and so violently.
Or maybe that's part of the point we're trying to look at, is that to hold together diverse cultures in a nation is hard, but important. And how we do that is we look at our common humanity, the things that unite us, our values. But it can be easy to splinter societies if we do identity politics, if we're trying to make people focus on their tribalism, it becomes very dangerous. And we become these extreme examples. Some of these, in Kosovo and Serbia, they lived together for generations. Were they really that different?
And it goes back to the slide and poet Joe Shear, that at the heart of human beings is good, but evil. And it emerges quite often based on slight triggers.
It almost looked like a model of success that completely exploded.
Well, it depends on who you ask, right? But indeed, to a point, to the extent there was harmony,
Yeah.
one would argue absolutely it had worked successfully in keeping these people together. Joe, and as Joe and I both recognize, and I kiddingly pointed to it when I shared a picture of Burnham and Jagan, that could have been Joe and I. And Joe and I could have had our relationship fractured by any number of external forces, but it wasn't. And so let's explore why that might be.
Sorry for
No, that's fine,
dominating the
that's fine.
conversation, but I'm just very curious about those things.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, let's get
Where we're going. So, if I were Rennick's psychologist and I was using only critical justice therapy, that we would look at our intersectionality, we would look at the current frame, and we would be only looking at that I'm a straight white guy, I'm a straight American. We would be looking at how our different experiences over time have affected us in that frame. And I'm gonna say, like, when we talk about this, like, what really, because in therapy, we want to have these real exchanges between people who can talk about hard things. So Rennick, if I'm gonna say, can you tell me about your traumas or things you've experienced, things I haven't,
what are the frames that we need to look at? How can I build trust? Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, and I would start off by saying not easily. And why would I say that? Because I grew up in a colony, and here's a good frame or perspective. That was saying, if you're white, everything is all right. If you're brown, you can stick around. If you're black, stay back. So I was conditioned, I heard that a lot of times. And I was further conditioned when I came to the United States because there was little opportunity. I remember the conversation I had with Brad, who said, Brad, how come this is all you're making? And I said to him, well, because I'm new to the country. And then I asked the other guy, Frank, what would it take to be advanced in this organization? He says, your suit needs to always be dark. And so I had those experiences. So when I run up to Joe, I have some hesitation. So what would Joe need to demonstrate to me to earn my trust? Absolutely. He would have to listen. Would have had to not give me any signals that he was unduly biased based on my race. And so that would have been some foundational elements to building trust.
Some of the problems with critical social justice therapy too is that the client has to believe that model is the only way to see things. So like how would Rennick feel if my language is saying, well, tell me about your microaggressions today? Or are we talking more about real people talking in a much larger thing over time, building trust? And that's the other part, like Rennick, one of his mantras is I want to be better than I'm doing, which is to understand that he wants to move beyond resentment and not stay stuck. So we're starting to build the jigsaw puzzle for you. And we're starting to look at, if we're going to address the issue of race, we need to have more elements than just the power lines. And also in therapy, I would be looking at this hardy stuff, the resiliency of the multiple traumas he's been through. I want to know the role spirituality plays in his life. And also the focus would not be on how are Rennick and I going to change society. Right, guys, that are successful, but I want to take that on. We work on you.
Can I ask you to pull that last slide back up so that, no, the next one, that one, so that we can get a picture of that new frame? Thank you.
We haven't covered all of it yet, too, so some of them won't make sense.
Yeah, this will just let us look at it. Thank you.
So the other part, like in our relationship, you know, we've had conflict with friends, seen things differently. We've worked it out, not always perfectly. We've had honest talks, you know, I'd ask him, like, what's it like to be a black man? He would ask me, what's it like to grow up in a poor, rural, white area? It's, you know, maybe like after Floyd's murder.
Yeah. I'm pretty connected. I've been in the community, I've belonged to organizations, served on boards, rubbed shoulders with a lot of players in Grand Rapids, and what was and active on social media. You know, I post all kinds of interesting things, educational, inspirational, and I get a lot of feedback. That's what we do on social media. And then there came the George Floyd episode in that period. And I put out a couple of little things to see check the temperature. I'm a smart guy, and there was silence from many of the people who communicated with me. Nothing. And I thought, this is interesting. Here is a trauma. Joe checked in.
Good.
A few other people did. Where were the others? I'm still trying to understand it. it was a significant, traumatic event for the country. I'm not gonna presume that I understood it, and they didn't, but we still need to have the dialogue a few years later.
So we have honest dialogue, we try to understand the differences, but we keep coming back that it's not our differences that define us. It's our common values that define us, common challenges. So, I guess this is where, in thinking about psychotherapy, the critical social justice therapy could be insulting and limiting, especially for people who don't buy this Neo-Marxist model. So now I'm going to bear with me a little bit. When we talk about a metamodel that hopefully we can begin to think about a larger frame. And so everybody knows who this is.
Yeah.
So this is the Geico caveman.
Yeah.
To understand one of the things about this model is, so why is he funny? Right? He's funny because he has the same level of consciousness as we have today. And of course, he's insulted by the ways they're insulting the caveman. And I'm going to say, though, the question is, that's presentism. So presentism is this way of looking at people in previous periods in history and interpreting their behavior and their attitudes through the lens of today's values and norms. So this is how it can result in a 20-year-old college student ripping down the statue of Abraham Lincoln or George Washington and feeling superior. And you hear people who were morally evolved in their time. And so the question is, does human consciousness evolve and grow and deepen? And interestingly, in these models, it's kind of similar to child development models, of where it started and where it is evolving toward. But does it evolve, or is it stagnant? Is it presentism?
What model is it?
This is Ken Wilber. He has a lot of complexity in different parts of this model, and this is his model of the evolution of human consciousness. So I'll talk about this a little bit, but we kind of have moved through periods of history where how we see ourselves and how we see the world is different and evolving. And this is part of my hope on how we get out of Wilber stuff today. So the early stage, when we became Homo sapiens, we formed tribes. We had kind of primitive beliefs and shared myths, and these were kind of eventually some early agricultural societies in Europe, like ancient Egypt. But as soon as we began to encounter each other, we had wars, and we took slaves. This isn't just due to the colonies of Western Europe. The next stage Wilber looks at is moving to the magic mythic, where we began to have the age of empire. And so now this is more psychologically, it's still egocentric, personal power, immediate gratification, but Genghis Khan and his son Kublai Khan had the largest empire ever in the history of the world. Then it moved into the mythic, coming into the Middle Ages, where there's more hierarchical structures, adherence to moral codes, religious codes, a desire for order, stability. But this is the time of maybe ancient Greek and Rome. But still, at this time, in the birthplace of democracy in Greece, 1 in 3 people were slaves. So then we move to modernity, which we still have a large portion of our world in. And this is where empires give way to modern states. So we begin to have a global market economy. We have a separation of church and state, and this is where, like we get professions like ours, that we start looking at the scientific method. And there's this movement for individual rights and meritocracy. And this is where, in the previous stage, religion defined everything. Now it's moving away to more secular ways of understanding the world. And it's in this period that there was a level of consciousness where we began to see how we were treating each other was wrong when it came to slavery. 80% of countries in the world. We eliminated it between 1780 and 1880, including our own after a bloody civil war. Now, we've been evolving into this frame, which is kind of getting stuck. In the postmodern frame, this is where the critical theory is coming from. They begin to challenge these grand narratives, universal truths. Are there any universal truths? And it begins to emphasize the subjective. It's a reaction to modernity. So my subjective experience is more important than just objective quantitative research. And it begins to look at these injustices and inequalities and challenge them, which needs to happen. However, it's moving in a direction that may be more dangerous, like identity politics, which didn't work out too well. Now, Wilber postulates that this is the next phase we could be moving into. Maybe only about 5% of that bell curve is here today. And in the integral phase, we move out of the postmodern and we begin to transcend this polarized thinking. We can embrace more complexity. And we begin to integrate, instead of separating religion and science, we begin to integrate artistic dimensions, spirituality, scientific endeavors. And we realize in this, as opposed to canceling, that I can't tolerate your view if it's different than mine, we begin to realize that the only way out is through collaboration and dialogue, that that's how problems are solved. And that's one of the goals we have for our organization. And then again, this, you can think about it, it takes a more sophisticated, evolved level of consciousness that we can actually cognitively hold opposing views and realize they both can exist. Light can be a wave and a particle. And then we can develop more complex models to address injustice than just splitting. So my hope for our organization as we're moving into this, only 5% of us are there, is that this is one of the things we can begin to do. Now, the culture wars are basically the battle between modernity and the postmodern. And this is where our tribes are fighting today. And this is where we see the postmodern paradigm is seeing that we need to oppose and cancel. We can't tolerate these other views. In the integral phase is how we look at, can we integrate the best things from the previous phases into a new way of being, and how we can move forward. Now, if we want to look at this specifically in psychotherapy, the evolution. So, this is from the 6 forces in the evolution of psychotherapy. So we began psychoanalytic. Freud and his followers became more behavioral approach, this black box, stimulate response, evolved into humanistic, existential, became multicultural, systemic, family therapy. Now we're in the social justice advocacy stage, and my hope is that we can move into the integral stage. It's more holistic and inclusive. And they talk about in their 6th force, the emergence of an international convergence movement is the most recent force. So they were anticipating that we would be born as an organization. So to challenge, to replace critical theory, so I'm going to challenge all of us, that if we're going to replace it, it can't be based on a Marxist or any promise of utopia. In Greek, the word utopia actually means no place. We can't assume that all people in the racial group have the same characteristics. We cannot use a model that creates splitting. We need to transcend polarized thinking. It needs to be more relational. So maybe this begins to make a little more sense. Bigger frame. So I'm suggesting that critical theory is the wrong frame to address such a serious problem. Now, Rennie will invite us to think about a way forward.
With a few more questions. Fundamental to our existence. What do we want for society, for ourselves and those who come behind us. Because that really ought to set the tone. And what needs to be liberated? And that presumes that something is in captive. Is that true? Is there a need for shift of economic and political disparities? Is there a sense that there's somewhere, as an undercurrent, a scarcity mindset? I would suggest, consistent with everything that we've discussed over the last 2 days, that it's the hearts and minds of all of us. And why? So that we may have a better chance at coexisting in some level of more peaceful and harmonious living. Coming full circle to our days in college, Bob Marley, yeah, he says it well. Emancipate ourselves from mental slavery. Again, if we acknowledge that maybe we could expand our minds a little more. Maybe we are not enslaved, our minds are not enslaved, but maybe there is some opportunity for us to be more expansive in our thinking. So what if you only, what if I only, and my family, our families, were to succeed, and others didn't? Well, go back to Guyana. What happens when there are these unreasonable divides? What do humans tend to?
Separation.
You know, what happens if we don't stop or slow down enough to try to understand the other side, the other person? Understand ourselves. And that's what you do. You invite us to slow down and do some introspection so we can have some greater self-awareness. It's true for all of us, individually and collectively. So we all have a choice. We can continue with those models, those older models, like critical social justice theory, that tend to divide, or we can pursue alternative approaches.
So are you suggesting the alternative approach would be the Bible construct that you can
The new frame.
and who's writing that? And whose conception is it?
We all learn. That's our challenge.
Lost.
We'll come back.
So yeah, we do get, and Joe, this would be a good time for you to elaborate actually on that question. So the fundamental question, and there are several, is are we gonna allow ourselves to disintegrate as a society and have this kind of conflagration like I experienced as a child? This is actually an image of the police station in Minneapolis. What were the undercurrents, to your question earlier, right? Or are we gonna become willing and strong enough to embrace each other, like Tracy Chapman did with Luke, at the big controversy of him having hijacked her song. How did he hijack her song? It's Joe speaks about artistic and spiritual enlightenment in a way. It's there, it's beautiful. Let everyone use it. Why not? So are we gonna create division by using these older models? Or are we gonna encourage? How did Joe and I get to discover that we were more similar than different? How may we do the same every day? And ultimately, how may some of the questions and some of the ideas we've shared help us all change our approaches? And if you practice therapy, change your approach to therapy. And ultimately, is there an opportunity to rethink how you think about these issues? We want to thank you for being such an attentive audience, and we invite your questions.